Welcome back, everyone, to the Nimber Tribe podcast. Today, I have Rachel Randolph on the pod with me. She teaches overwhelmed professionals holistic tools for clear communication. It's so good to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Nina. This is obviously my favorite topic to nerd out on, so I'm excited to discuss it more.
Where I would like to start is just a little bit of your origin story, because I think every superhero has their own little origin story. So if you could maybe tell people a little bit about your background and specifically how you found your way to the topic of communication.
Yeah, gosh, loaded question, of course.
Yes.
I like being honest about this because I don't want people to get a false impression of where I started. Like, I went to school for communications and I've always been good at this, and this is what my dream job has been. I think a lot of going off the hero trope is that they didn't intend to be where they are or in the positions that they're in, and maybe they fought being in that position for a while, and it was a bit of a horror story before it was a hero's journey. And so I would
Yep.
say that is my origin story, is very rough. A little bit of a rough childhood, neglected middle child of two, and through my teens, through my 20s, I was a terrible communicator, really quite bad. Dealt with and still deal with some anxiety and depression in episodes in different phases of life, and had very little resource for it for a really long time. And I didn't go to school for communications or anything like that. I went to culinary school. And this journey really starts with me having lost my job due to an injury at 21. So I had my life planned out to be a pastry cook, went to culinary school, found my trade, found my passion, and then it was ripped away from me. And anyone who shares a story of losing a career not by their own choice might know that that also comes with a lot of identity crisis and internal strife to try and start over when maybe you thought that you had everything figured out already. And so my 20s were painted with a lot of anxiety and stress, and on and off medication, in and out of therapy to try and figure out what to do. And all the while, with all these diagnoses and therapies of you have a chemical imbalance, you need to go to therapy for this, you're chronically anxious. No one ever stopped to ask me, how are my relationships? How is my internal dialogue? How do I perceive myself? What do I do to take care of myself internally? And then, how do I functionally build a positive inner experience? Like, literally, no one ever asked me those questions. And I started piecing together that not only was I not the only one who struggled with anxiety and depression, like, we have a total epidemic of research backing that this is a struggle for most people internationally, like worldwide, not just in America where I live. But the personal development industry, books, self-help, speakers, motivation, confidence, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Like, the research that I was doing back in 2022-ish was that by 2024, it would be a $6.2 billion industry. And pandemic aside, of course it had an influence on this, but painting the picture of there is something missing. There is a distressing dichotomy between, or paradox between, the epidemic of depression, anxiety, suicide rates going up, and people being generally unhappy, and how much money this industry is actually making, pumping out this personal development and self-help rhetoric. And so I'm like, whoa, what the heck? I am I am on one side of this, looking at the other side, saying something is missing. And so I started my business when I was 27 with the idea that no one is talking about talking. No one is talking about inner talking. And no one is stopping to ask what the difference that could make a difference actually is. We're just continuously regurgitating and being regurgitated at from old self help rhetorics. And so here I am, 27, trying to find the thing that will help me. And I stumbled upon, I had a mindfulness practice because I'm trying to follow the meditation and presence and speaking from your authentic selfness. I was very much involved in trying to develop myself that way and struggling and continuously hitting these walls of why doesn't this work for me? What is wrong with me? And then ultimately no one asking me what was actually my experience, my internal experience of these things. And so that's where I discovered NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, which is this body of psychology that helps you understand the way that you speak to yourself will directly influence the way that you experience yourself and ultimately the world. And so I studied NLP and I married it with my mindfulness practices so I could understand the programming that was influencing my present moment at all times. And then I slowly, slowly went inward with this of like introspection, mindfulness, heart, emotional regulation, heart coherence, and NLP modalities. And from there, my business spec, now the spec method, was born. And spec simply means to look, see. It's a root word. So I thought it was the most effective way to essentially communicate that the way that I am going about this coaching for communication skills is by looking internally. I'm not going to teach you how to present to a group of board members. I don't care. I'm I'm going to teach you how to look in the mirror and be happy with what you see.
I love that. There's so much in there. And I think what is really interesting about like the self-help world is that it often seems like a little bit of a mystery going on there. Like just pay more and you're gonna find that missing link. And I love that you are pointing the arrow back in and be like, no, the answer is somewhere in you. Like, let's unpack that a little bit more. And also something that struck me when you were talking is when I think about communication, it is kind of an outward facing word in the first sense. Like you think about two people
Oh, yeah.
communicating, you communicating in the boardroom, like all that you just mentioned. But so much of it starts internally because like language is such a funny thing that we have as humans that we experience and how we make up the world. So can you maybe explain a little bit more what you mean by that? Like what is that internal dialogue and how is that actually shaping our reality?
Yeah. So I just did this morning, or I'm doing it constantly. We're all doing it constantly. We still in I want to say as a culture and science, we still don't really understand what consciousness is, what the inner dialogue is, and these thoughts. But we, almost all of us, I do know that there are some people that don't have an inner dialogue; they only have pictures, like internal pictures, and then some people have the opposite, where they only have dialogue and no pictures. So it's a funny thing, and I would be way out of line to say, "Oh, I'm an expert at what this is." I am an expert, however, at what it is for me. And that's where I start this kind of answer to this question is when I am speaking to myself, it is very much so a conversation. That's why the communication or inner communication or inner dialogue die too still applies. I don't actually feel it's a monologue, an internal monologue of just me saying something for me. It is me saying something to myself, and I myself or this other voice can have a reaction to this dialogue. So that's where there's, you know, there's in internal family representation systems or internal family systems, there's multiple parts of, there's the father, there's the critic, there's the manager, there's the mothering voice, there's the older sister. There's a lot of different voices that can be labeled, and that's helpful. So that's where I would take that. And what my work does is helps pull from lots of different resources and modalities. If that works for them, that a certain person I'm working with, we run with that narrative. If it doesn't work for them, we find something else, because it is most important for them to understand how they work internally. What can they align with, or what feels most comfortable for them to assign the thoughts and experience they're having on the inside with this inner dialogue or inner communication. And so, again, dialing it back to this deeper layer of like, I don't have an expertise on what that is. I don't know what that is. I don't even know if the people who say that they know what it is know what it is. It's thought, energy, brain waves that we can measure, and then getting that on the same page with our heart when we have a sensation or a feeling. That's like our heart communication that can be measured. And then we have an internal sense of, oh, that's icky. Oh, I'm not sure that person is the right person to be hanging out with. I don't want to do this. And then getting all of those three intelligences on the same page is the expertise of internal communication in my mind, in my experience, what I teach, and what ultimately has results. Like, I've been doing this for 6 years, so there is some effectiveness to it. And people continue seeking it out. So I would say that for the right people, or for the people who are oriented in this way, it makes a lot of sense to them to draw attention to those inner perspectives, get a grasp on them, understand how they influence their behavior in turn, and then that feedback loop of, well, their behavior will be a response to their internal processing. And so the better that they are at understanding their internal processing, the better they will be at, I want this to happen in my life here. I want this conversation to go this way with this person. I want this communication or confrontation to go, and the ideal outcome would be having this intention. So there are these tiny little things that can be leveraged when there is a masterful connection to one's own inner dialogue.
I love that.
But here,
If I'm
I feel
just
like that was a little bit of a windy road.
No, but it made perfect sense. Like, but what I was thinking when you were saying that is, when I think back of kind of myself, maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago or something like that, and you would have given me that answer, I would have been like, yeah, I have like voices in my head. But I think at least for me, I was quite disconnected in a way. Like, I'm someone who's really good in tuning into other people, but less good like tuning into me. So if you would have a client who would be like, yeah, like, I get it, Rachel, like, I should listen to my intuition, and like, I should listen to these voices, and I should guide them in different directions. Like, where do I even start? Like, how do I foster that first connection with that intuition with myself? Where do we begin?
Oh, I love this question. And I have the most silly, innocent answer. Just saying hello. And I know that sounds silly. But it is the most intuitive answer to that, because I don't know where someone would start. It's completely unique to their experience. And until I'm sitting in front of them and they might give me that how they're interpreting what is happening to them, I couldn't say anything. But what I would tell you, if you were 10 years ago saying that you have voices and you register them, but you don't know what to do with them, you don't know what they are, you don't know where to start in labeling them, I would tell you, start with saying hello to yourself, either in the mirror and just say, hello, how are you today? Or, hello, we're going to have a good day today, okay? And then smile, give like a thumbs up. And then in a journaling perspective, saying hello. So when I first started doing this practicing, I would start my journals saying hello, because the first step to connecting with anyone, you would argue, is to say hello and introduce yourself. And so, again, I think maybe that's a little silly and it seems rudimentary, but I can almost assure you that just by greeting yourself, you are starting the process of getting warmed up with the idea, even the idea that you can have a relationship with yourself and a connection internally.
Awesome. Yes, I love the simplicity of that, actually. If we take it one step further and we think about kind of communication also outwardly, I think there are so many elements that play into that. Yes, it's what you say, it's your intention, but it's also the confidence. It's also where are you at? Are you like super agitated or are you calm when you are like saying
Yeah.
something? So I don't know if you can give us maybe a definition of how you see like good communication, what that even means to you,
Mm,
if you want to, or like where you want to take this and unpack it just a little bit.
yeah. Okay. I love the idea of just starting with semantics. What is good communication to me? So, communication to me, thinking in an external, maybe the internal too. We'll see if it plays out like that. But I would say good communication is clear, honest, and thoughtful. And I'll tack on relevant because
Hmm.
obviously we don't want to be trying to get a message across that isn't relevant to the other person or the situation. And so it's important to, when considering another person, to make sure that the communication is relevant to the situation. Now, I don't mean that's only like, oh, I know to be really rigid and strict about what I'm saying. It's more of a, if the situation calls for sharing about my day or some drama happening with a boy, that's relevant to the experience. And I'm dialed into that and I'm aware of it. And my communication will be received because that is the agreed upon intention. If I don't know the agreed upon intention, good communication would be, hey, I would like to share about my psychodrama right now, influenced by a boy. Is that cool? And so then I'm externally inviting somebody into my internal world and getting their consent. So, in the same vein, I think internal communication being really affected might look the same way. Hey, what's going on here? I'm gonna be really sensitive to what's going on with myself. And this is where understanding the utility of the inner critic and not negating it or shunning it, but is that relevant right now? No, right now we need self-love or we need to be a little bit patient with ourselves. Okay, so we're gonna try on the patient voice and say, I see that you're going through something really rough right now, Rachel. We're gonna table the productivity for 10 minutes, give yourself a little bit of a break. So that in my mind is effective, good communication with myself. They kind of look similar, but again, it's just attuning to what is relevant and by attuning to what's relevant, that requires presence. So that's a whole nother realm for communication being effective is being able to be where you are. Yes, there's distractions. Yes, there's other things that require my attention. And acknowledging those things and being where I am is one of those skills that is conducive to effective communication. So these are all these little nuances that I teach people to be more attentive to. It's not presentations, it's not winning things, it's not winning the conversation, it's not being able to manipulate people. It's from the 100% different direction or a 180 degrees different approach to how communication has typically been taught.
Super, super interesting. And I would like to come back to that. But there was one thing that you mentioned, which I kind of want to zoom in on a little bit, and that is the inner critic, because that's something that comes up a lot with the people that I coach, because we all have that voice, right? It might sound slightly different. It might even sound different on different days for the same person. But we all have this little chatterbox that is just not really on our side. And what I see a lot of people do, and I feel like there's quite a little bit of advice out there, and I would love to pick your brain on it, is there's this narrative that we should just overpower it with positive thoughts and positive words. And for me, that's kind of exactly the wrong approach. Like, I'm always super, super curious to be like, okay, there is an inner critic. Why would that be useful? What is this voice saying? Why is it there? Is it protecting you in any way? So yeah, I would be super curious how you think about the inner critic and how to kind of make friends with it, or like what should we do with that inner critic?
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of different options. And I think maybe that even is the number one thing to identify is that there are options. Even what I just first said is my response of like, look at how many options you just listed of how to respond to and interpret the inner critic, I'll say. It takes a little bit of practice to be able to discern that rather than be reactive to the inner critic. So an example of reactive to the inner critic would just be continuing to go down a shame path of, I did this. This voice in my head is like letting me know I did this, or I feel this, or I'm experiencing this, or I should or shouldn't, depending on the language that one uses with themselves, that what they would label as the inner critic. Because again, you're right, they do sound different and varies on the person. And being able to create just a tiny bit of separation between self, like myself, my person, my whole being, irrelevant of what happens in my life. I am a whole, sovereign, autonomous being. And I have this inner critic, and I have the self love voice, and I have the manager and the mother, and I have all these people or these voices or these perspectives that I can take. And that is where I believe utility of the inner critic can come into play. It might not be that on the onset. It might be necessary to diffuse the inner critic at first, or and like hands up, duck feathers, like can't touch me. There's nothing I need to do about this voice. I just need to breathe. That's it. And then there's once that diffusion can happen, there's a little bit like, okay, what is this inner voice actually saying? Is it right? And I am about to make a mistake? Or is it somebody else's voice? Oftentimes when I'm working with someone, they tell me that their inner critic wasn't even their voice or wasn't even things that they've said to themselves. It's things that they've heard or things that they've even seen or observed happen to someone else, that they have this voice of warning or you shouldn't do that because you might get canceled kind of thing. And it's like, wait, this is totally reasonable and in line for me to do or speak about, or this is what I want to do that's in line with my values. Like, no, that's not necessary. So in turn, or I'll say in a summary, with any voice, even the self-compassion voice that's like very cooey and like you're fine. You don't need to apologize. You don't need to take accountability for that. That can also be kind of a trap, a little bit of a trap in the same vein as the inner critic. And being able to be the observer perspective and hold those voices, regardless of what they are, and the words that they're using out in front of us just a little bit, just creating a tiny bit of space between the thing that we're saying and who we actually believe ourselves to be. This is why the inner dialogue being proactively developed is so important. That is where you can observe and take a different approach to it. And that's where those options become relevant, but not necessarily in my work. Those options aren't even available to us until we have a little bit of separation between ourselves as a whole autonomous sovereign being and what we want to do about our lives and inner critics and inner voices.
100%. And I think it's so interesting, like we can get so identified with these kind of different voices. And there are, at least in my life, there are situations where it's really clear to me that there is kind of an inner voice that I have a little bit of distance to, like something very typical, like you're driving on a road and then something in your brain said it would be really nice to just go in the other lane and like drive into another car. Like I'm very much aware of like, oh, this is kind of a stupid thought, like this is not me in a way, or like I don't want to act on that. But then in other situations where I might be fighting with my partner or whatever, these voices all of a sudden seem to be me. Like this is me talking.
Yeah.
How can we come to a space where there is a little bit more of that distance, where we can see it as like, oh, there is something talking, there is a thought coming into my consciousness. Like,
Yeah.
how can we get to that distance part?
Yeah. Honestly, breath work. Getting into the body and embodiment is something that a lot of people are starting to talk about. And it is a very powerful healing modality in practice. I find it a bit impractical to be trying to drop into the body while we're in a state of reactivity to our own inner dialogue. So I practice this myself in a proactive way. I bring in the intention of proactivity. So I'm in a really calm state. I've just had my coffee in the morning. I don't have anything going on at the moment. I register that I'm in a moment of like relative peace and calm. That is where I practice breathing and I practice watching thoughts. And this is essentially a mindfulness practice that I believe is way more practical than like, I need to meditate for 3 hours and do this. There's so much rigidity around that. But I propose that it could, and should. I don't want to say those words. I want to give the option that it could be something done in day-to-day life, practicing things that do make us happy. And so when we practice getting into our bodies, what is my heart doing right now? What is my mind doing right now? What does my intuition feel like right now? What does my left knee feel like right now? Doing a bit of a body scan. And then when we're in those moments of intensity where we are getting associated with that thought, and instead of hyperreactivity of dissociation from that thought, which is a common experience that people have when it's too much, and that's where trauma starts happening. Too much at in too short a time. So to be able to proactively know what it feels like and follow that path and practice doing that little by little, it does create the strength to diffuse that space between reactivity and the ability to respond. So that's where reaction versus responding comes in. And people will throw that around like it's easy and willy-nilly, but it's not. It requires, especially if there's a lot of stress, you've got young kids, you've got a high stakes, high stress job. It is a lot to ask for someone to just respond, oh, very nicely. Like, I give people a lot of credit for communicating as well as they do, considering that no one was really taught how to create that distance and flex that muscle of responding. Again, this is an internal experience, being able to delay the response between me and myself and me and another person. It's a lot to ask. It's a lot going on.
It really is, yes. And I think it's such it's such a important piece to kind of be like, okay, we practice this in an environment where the stakes are really low, so we can get good at it. Like we can really build that relationship with ourselves and regulate our nervous system, and then we can take that into more higher stake kind of scenarios and build on that skill.
And the idea that high stakes and low stakes is really only dependent on how regulated or dysregulated our nervous system is. And I don't enjoy oversimplifying it like that. For the sake of simplifying it for listeners, maybe that is an easy little thing to take away from. I like providing a lot of explanation and context for these things because that's what people maybe they can't hear themselves. And if I just diffuse it, then, well, that seems like I don't understand that. But if I explain the different components, then maybe there's something that someone can latch onto. And that's the priority to me. I don't believe in oversimplifying these things. There are a lot of nuances to communication that get completely overlooked.
In terms of being overlooked, or also like, is there something that you see where you often feel like I would really like to jump into that conversation and just give a little bit more clarity? Like, are there specific topics where you're like, oh man, I wish I could have just speak on that and create a little bit more of that guidance and explanation?
I feel like if I get the inkling of something that I want to speak on, that I see, on LinkedIn is a good example of things being thrown around. Um, I will literally just write my own post about it. Um, I will probably engage with that and drop my own thoughts. I am pretty vocal on that platform when I have an opinion about something, and sometimes I just wait and see what happens and noodle on it a little bit more and then write my own post. So today is a really good example of I've seen a lot of people talking about wanting more people to take accountability for themselves and that they aren't and that our leaders aren't. And if they just, and I'm watching and watching and thinking, you know, I don't even know if people know what taking accountability versus apologizing actually is. And that's where my mind starts thinking it's empathy, it's cognitive empathy of anything that somebody starts getting all like worked up about, especially using the dialogue of if they just blank. That's when I kick in my cognitive empathy gear and say, if they just what? If they just were a different person with different foundations and opinions and beliefs and morals, like if they just what, you know? And so that's where I take that idea that I've had or inspiration that I've had from somebody else's kind of maybe harsh criticism of someone and offer I'm not excusing these things, but I am empathizing with the idea that we don't know what's going on with someone at any given time. First of all, we completely lose sight of that, especially in the realm of communication. We think that someone's opinion or someone's position has equaled good leadership or good communication skills or the ability to do these things, and that is inaccurate. It is also limited by their own resources, internal and external. And so I think across the board, how to answer that question would be when someone is oversimplifying something that is complicated and externalizing it rather than talking from personal perspective, that is where I will lead by example and share my opinion and also create a resource or an opportunity to learn for people who might also share that criticism or see themselves in that person being criticized.
I feel like it kind of comes back a little bit to that point that you talked about with the intent. Like, we don't know where that other person is at. So maybe having in the beginning of the discussion just a dialogue around, like, what are we actually sharing now? Like, where do we even have the capacity to kind of listen and hold and respond to? I think it is really, really important. So that, yeah,
Yeah,
that
people
makes
kind
a
of
lot of sense.
assume, again, I put in the point of people assuming that a leadership position means that they have no issues with these things. And that's just inaccurate. Um, Not only because I work with these executives and leaders that struggle with these things and the pressure cooker of the expectation from the top and the expectation from the bottom. The top wants them to get something done, and the bottom wants them to explain everything that they're needing to get done. And that is from some of the experiences and stories that I've heard, such an impossible task. And yet, the people and leaders that I work with that want to develop their ability to do that are so heart and soul centered and don't know how to stay and lead from that place because of so much pressure. So, I hear firsthand some of the things that are happening in corporate America and the nuances of those experiences not being addressed. And that's where my work comes into play of like, hold the phone. We have a lot of little tiny pieces to like build upon here.
Yes. And you touched a little bit on the inner resources, and I guess also maybe the method that you're using to kind of develop these inner resources. Can you share a little bit more with the audience? Like we have already talked a little bit about the inner dialogue, but like what else is there to create this inner resource so that we can communicate better internally and externally?
That come to mind that are really helpful considering like where most people are at, which is not having spent a lot of time with these resources. I want to first say journaling is so useful. I'm not just saying journaling, but I am going to say journaling as like a base layer to start these practices. Journaling is very powerful because it is a way to engage with that your inner experience externally without involving someone else and without necessarily having it be in this like rigid, sterile experience of therapy. It's somewhere in the middle of venting to a friend and therapy. So I am a huge proponent of journaling. To tack on journaling, the skill that I work with most of my clients on the onset to start building out this interaction, inner inter interaction is called the Lazarus technique. It is a tool for abstraction, and it's one of the first NLP tools that I learned that I was immediately able to implement and see positive results. So, like most of the tools that I teach in my methodology, the ROI is kind of instant, especially with communication is one of those things that you can say like, I talked like this and this happened. I'm going to try it like this next time. I talked like this and this happened. Wow, different. So I do feel like, not to make it robotic, but I do feel like it's a very instant gratification type of work. So the Lazarus technique is very useful in, say, you are going into a confrontation or a meeting with your boss and you are very scattered in your thoughts, your mind's racing, you don't know what you're going to say, or, kind of any experience, maybe being in a meeting and being called upon to share, or in a interpersonal relationship with your partner and you've had a disagreement or miscommunication, you're aware that there's a miscommunication and you need to get back on the same page. So all kind of like very mental flurrying types of experiences because of cortisol. Our natural stress response and adrenaline is to make us prepared for what we need to do next. And that includes like thinking and problem solving and shutting down all the other areas. So we need to open that back up. And one way to do that is to distill down those thoughts into just a sentence and then just a word of the intention. So a way to say, okay, I'm in an experience right now where I have a lot of thoughts and I need to share my key points or key intention. What is my key intention? And then my brain, I think our brains really like being assigned things. Actually, I know our brains really like being assigned things because we have our right side for abstraction. This is where this comes into play. Lots of options. And then our left side brain, our categorization, our rigidity, our processing system. So we need both of them. And what the Lazarus technique helps do is use both sides to, okay, a lot going on, a lot of different options. What's the most important thing to do here? Down to one word. And it's very challenging at first for my clients to do this. They have no idea what to do. And with some practice, very little practice actually, they are able to distill down what is very nebulous and complicated into one sentence, into one word. And then they bring that one word of intention or one point of conversation to the forefront. So it's a clarifying technique.
I love that one. And then with that clarity, they can then meet that conversation is what I'm hearing, right? Like I create clarity in my head, I still it down, and then I have a clear intent going into that interaction.
And I preface that with journaling because it's much easier to start this process instead of doing it in your head, and especially without doing it orally, like where you kind of brain dump on somebody. I don't know if you've ever done this, but before, old Rachel used to just say everything and then be like, like 90% of that wasn't true. What I actually just meant to say was this one thing. But I had to process and vocally process with the other person, and it wasn't really necessary. It's also really difficult to only do that internally. So that's where I say this middle function of a journal of writing down and then asking yourself, what is the most important thing to say here? Or what is my intention with this experience or the situation? What does the situation need that is most useful? Or what intention can I bring in that's most useful? There's lots of different prompts that can be helpful here. But at the end of the day, it's a distillation process.
Super cool. Yes, we have a tool that we can walk away with and practice immediately. That's awesome. I would love to ask you where people can find you if they would like to have a little bit more guidance in all of that. And also if there's maybe something more that you feel like we have missed so far and that you just wanted to snug in there for the listeners to know before we round everything up.
Yeah. Well, I think LinkedIn these days, LinkedIn and my website. My website has tons of resources and it's very robust with ways to start thinking differently about communication. I believe that communication is the both start and finish of almost all issues and problems we have in life. They are the source of and they are the resolution of. And so just thinking about it differently is, I think this is what I want to say. You can find me on these two places, but what I want to say is to start thinking about communication just a little bit differently. And when you're doing that, that's when to start finding me or to reach out, because my work leverages self-awareness. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of like piecing this together, but my work leverages self-awareness. And I don't think that there's any shortage of people being self-aware. I think all of us have all of these skills embedded in us. I don't think I'm inventing the wheel with these tools. I am only helping people leverage that self-awareness and interest in communicating differently from more of their heart and their soul and who they truly are as a person. I'm not teaching them how to be who they are. I'm teaching them how to be strong in who they already know that they are, and then communicate effectively through that place. So if someone is at that space, that's when it makes a lot of sense to reach out, tell me where they want to take that next. They have been on this journey for a while, and if nothing has worked, much like how nothing worked for me, that's when to interact with me. Outside of the idea of like just saying hello and introducing themselves, I still love that too. But if they wanted to work with the mindset that they're going in with that is really important to me. And so LinkedIn and my website, and that's it. That's all I think. I think thinking about communication is the thing that I would leave people with, wanting them to remember from this talk, is think about think about it. Start feeling into it. Because honestly, nobody's been taught. Nobody's been sat down. No, nobody that I know, personally, not me, has been taught and sat down. And like, if you have that intention when you're communicating, what do you think will happen, little 7-year-old Rachel? Or if you lie to someone, what do you think that will do to the trust in your relationship? What do you think trust is? That's just not something happening to most of us. And so bringing a little bit more consciousness into the idea that we're all learning how to do this and not to externalize it.
Yes, amen to that. And I love that kind of intention that you're setting there. Like, start to think about communication. I think those questions, like for everyone who wants to start to journal, like those are amazing starter questions to just get into the habit of like writing down your thoughts and like looking at them in a journaling practice. I think that can be super, super helpful.
And on my website, I do have several free resources, and one of them is a 30 journal prompts to apply your self-awareness to communication specifically.
Awesome. Yes, we're going to link all of that down below for everyone who wants to check out Rachel. Please do so. I really enjoy following her on those different platforms. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Nina. I really love this conversation, and you're catching me at a time where I am reorganizing how this passion shows up and how my work shows up. And it's really exciting to have people interested in it as much as I am.
This was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Tribe. Thank you so much for watching this episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like and a comment below. There's going to be new episodes dropping every Wednesday, covering everything from entrepreneurship to health, basically giving you all the tools that you need to peak perform in business and in your life. So please make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. This is a one-woman show. There is no network, there are no sponsors, and there is no editing team behind this, so it's up to me and you to spread the word about it. So if you have a friend who might benefit from what you learned today in this episode, please make sure to share a link with them. I see you next Wednesday. Much love.